Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode on AZ Security. My name is Dylan Paardenkoper. I'm a cloud security architect at IT Impressive. And for today, I have a special guest, and that is Thomas. Thomas, welcome.
Hey, Dion. Thank you for having me today.
Cool. And for today, we have a special topic around Azure Local. For everybody who's new to the topic, Thomas, can you explain what it is?
Yeah, absolutely. So, if you want to know, there is certain scenarios where customers use the public cloud, right? But then they have different kinds of regulations or sovereign requirements where they need to basically be able to run locally in their own environments. And that could be, again, as I mentioned, these regulations or other things, but also technical reasons why they probably need to be completely disconnected or at least don't have the latency to the public cloud so that they can run it locally. So that is where we said, hey, with Azure Local, we bring in an infrastructure platform which allows you to do virtualization, but then also at the same time, you can then do modern applications, cloud native applications on top of Kubernetes or using some of the Azure services as well. And so, yeah, that is basically the introduction of our sovereign private cloud with Azure Local.
True. And how long do you work with this technology at Microsoft?
Wow. I think if you go all the way back, so currently I'm a GBB, a Global Black Belt for sovereign cloud. So not just covering Azure Local and private cloud, but also the public cloud aspects of it. And then before that, I was 3 years in the product group for Azure Local and Azure Arc, working with some of the strategic customers as a PM. And then before that, I was in advocacy, where I also did work with Azure Arc and Azure Local a lot. And actually, well, back then it was not Azure Local. Back then it was Azure Stack,
Azure
right?
Stack, right? Yeah.
And then I think I remember, I think it was in 2015 when I was MVP. I was not working for Microsoft back then, but I think that was the first time Microsoft introduced Azure Stack Hub. And that was basically my first, it was the Azure Stack, but then that was transitioned to Hub. So I was working then. And even before that already, I remember I just had conversations with some colleagues as well. I was working in 2012. There was this big initiative of Microsoft with Hyper-V and System Center to build the Microsoft private cloud.
Yes, I know.
So, so basically almost my whole career now, or I would say in the Microsoft space, is based on technologies with Azure Local, hybrid cloud, but cloud scenarios as well. So yeah, that's basically a very long time, I just realized.
It's going way back. Yeah, I also worked in the past with the Azure Stack when it just got released, and I think it was around that timeline as you mentioned. Yeah.
Yeah, it was good times, to be honest. But it's also great where we have come now. I think now we are on a very good path, or we are in a good position now, addressing exactly the needs and had a lot of these learnings from the past, what customers need and what customers want. And also, I have to say, the market also changed in that regards as well.
Definitely. There's a big need to still use the cloud as much as possible. But as you mentioned, the regulations, but also the law, which gives us some hard times to make other changes and to be compliant.
Yeah, we have this internal slide where some research went in, and we basically, I remember when you said talk about regulations, right? I think we have the slide where it says hey, every 4 to 5 days we have a new regulation coming up targeting cybersecurity, AI, or any of that, and that obviously makes things difficult for customers and organizations. But still, it just shows how complex the whole situation has become.
Definitely, definitely. Do you want to share something with
Yeah.
us?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's good to have an introduction for people who are not that familiar with Azure Local, right? I think it's always good to have a quick introduction. And usually this is my favorite slide to explain a little bit on what Azure Local can do or what it is. So when we start on the bottom, obviously we need to have some infrastructure, right? The customer, the organization, you need to have deploy some sort of infrastructure in either your own data center or at your edge locations. And Azure Local really offers a wide range of different solutions there, from very small form factor devices, think about factories or retail store scenarios, up to multi-rack deployments with hundreds of servers for these large scale data center parts as well. and then basically every single thing in between, right? Where you could imagine, hey, I need a rack, I need half a rack, I need a rack in 2 rooms or something like that. All these different capabilities we can address together with our hardware partners. And I mentioned that we're working with our OEMs such as HP, Dell, Lenovo, and many others there. Um, to address this and offer that, right? So it's not Microsoft hardware, it's hardware for our OEMs. And so again, if you have existing relationships with your OEM, that is great. You can leverage these as well. And then also I have to say, usually this is done in hyperconverged or was done in hyperconverged. We just also announced SAN storage support. So we now have a disaggregated model where you can, first of all, you can add SAN to your existing Azure local environments, but you can also build disaggregated models, where you only use SAN storage. And that allows you, for example, to build now cluster instances up to 64 nodes per cluster or per instance. And then I will show you that a little bit later with our multi-rack solution, we can even go up to 128 nodes per instance. And again, customers can obviously have multiples of those instances, such as you would do today. You would split those up, right, in different clusters. And so on, depending on the scale you need. And then what we do on top of that is we basically provide what I call our software-defined data center stack, right, for compute, storage, networking, and also the availability part to make sure things are redundant. And so then you can basically run VMs, different types of Linux and Windows VMs there. You can also run AKS on top of it, or your own Kubernetes cluster. But again, you get AKS kind of like as a managed service, right? Where you can just say, hey, or as a service where you just can say, hey, I want to have AKS, I need a new cluster. Let's go. Similar as you do in Azure, right? And then I think where the real power comes in, right? This is not just another virtualization platform. It's really like then by Arc enabling it, bring the power of the cloud to these environments which are outside of the Azure regions or data centers. So we call this Azure Arc. I think I'm sure like a lot of you guys are already familiar with Azure Arc, but really it's a technology which bridges the infrastructure, the local infrastructure, in this case Azure Local, to the Azure control plane and to Resource Manager, and allows them basically to use these services. So on top of that, you can then use these different Azure services, and I divide them in 2 buckets. So one bucket is kind of like what I call the Arc-enabled infrastructure, where we take advantage of management services, such as, for example, Microsoft Defender or Azure Monitor, and you connect them from the cloud to your local infrastructure there as well. And then the other bucket is where we call Arc-enabled services, where you can really take the full service and run it locally in either connected or disconnected mode. So think about things like Foundry Local for AI, think about M365 Local. We just announced GitHub Enterprise Local as well. So those things you can really run on top of Azure Local without any connectivity to the cloud there as well. The same thing, by the way, is very interesting with a lot of use cases also for virtual desktops. And then I think what you're talking today, this is very important about this scenario is, hey, usually your Azure Local instance would be connected, right? So it would be attached to the Azure Cloud control plane, meaning you would manage it through the Azure portal, through the Azure APIs, which gives you the advantage of using role-based access control from RBAC and so on, and all the management tools, and basically using the same thing. So if you use pipelines to deploy against Azure, you can also use these pipelines to deploy against Azure Local, for example. And don't get me wrong, these connected environments, if they disconnect for a few hours or days, that's not an issue. I mean, the only thing you lose is basically the control plane you usually use, but the workloads keep on running. So it's not that like, hey, if I'm disconnected, like things just go offline or something. That's not the case. So even in connected mode, you can resist some disconnect there as well. But then some customer told us like, hey, we have scenarios where we can't really be connected at all. We want to be like a fully disconnected or air-gapped environment. And that is where we introduced Azure Local Disconnected Operations, which is GA since February 2026 now. And so what we did here is, as you can see on the left side, when you look at Azure Local Connected, you have the control plane, again, meaning Resource Manager, the portal, and so on. And you connect your Azure Local infrastructure as well as the workloads running on Azure Local to this control plane. And then in disconnected mode, what we did is we basically ship an appliance VM, which packs in parts of Azure Resource Manager, parts of the portal, parts of the same APIs into an appliance VM the customer would deploy locally. And then that's where they can then connect their Azure local infrastructure as well as their workloads instead to public Azure. They can connect that local control plane. In that case, it never needs any connection at any point in time, right? I mean, I need to point this out because some people still think there needs to be at one point a connection for later on for billing and things like that. That's not the case, right? If you want to deploy it completely disconnected, you can deploy it completely disconnected. Like interesting, like for example, how updates work, right? What that would mean, and you're probably familiar with like the old Azure Stack scenarios where you can basically download it externally, copy it on a USB stick or on a drive, or copy it to a file share, bring it into your disconnected environment, and then import it. That's basically how this is done, and this is done for all the different parts which you need to report or anything like that.
And do you see a lot of customers using it already?
So, I mean, for the interest is massive, right? So the conversations we are having, I mean, I speak with the customers daily, like about these scenarios, and I think that was kind of like the missing piece in the puzzle is where customers said, "Hey, it's great. Like we understand, we want to have like this cloud, right? We want to run in the cloud. We want to be also connected. But what in the case of a scenario where we need to be disconnected?" Either from the beginning, or what if like we need to disconnect later on, what do we do, right? And once we release this, people are really starting, okay, now we need to look even more into this. And so we are basically, almost my full-time job is about have conversations with customer with this and helping them starting their POCs and starting their implementation projects and so on. And obviously it's new, but obviously we developed that over months and years. So we already worked with some customers. Obviously, you can imagine that they are in very secretive sectors, but we worked with them. Obviously, they already implemented. We tested with them. There are already implementations there. So yeah, there's a huge interest, I would say, in that. And again, what I want to stress out, it's not that we see now customers saying, "Hey, I want to move everything I have to that environment." Right? What I see is that need to have some customers need to have a plan B option where they say, okay, this is going to be that's how I plan address that question. Then others have some real workloads, right? I work with some customers in the energy sector, for example, where they need to be disconnected environments but still distributed for like you can imagine different scenarios there. And they are highly interested to do that the same way, to run that infrastructure, have that experience same as they have in Azure, but be basically fully disconnected because they're not allowed to have any connections there as well. And the other part, I mean, which is illustrating, I just want to add this as well, is the VMware Broadcom scenario where a lot of customers are looking now for alternatives. And I think like Azure Local can be a great alternative there as well.
Yeah, I heard that on my customers, like we have to jump to something else. And this is definitely one which they are investigating in. Is there a way that I can start with one and go to another in this picture?
Very good. That's a very good question. So today you choose basically if your cluster, your workload cluster for Azure Local is connected or disconnected. However, we have on the roadmap that we want to offer customers to switch once they are connected to say, hey, I need to switch to disconnected so that they can do that, right? So that's on the roadmap, but currently you would choose which one you want to have. And we have customers who have both, right? They decided to have different stuff for different workloads, for example, different requirements. So they have some Azure Local connected and some Azure Locals which are disconnected as well, which are for them different environments depending on, again, their specific requirements.
Cool. Do you have a demo?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me quickly switch to my demo environment. I can show you two things. I also want to show you one more thing. I'm actually happy to have recently access to that. So what I'm going to show you, just give me a sec. Yeah. So what I'm going to show you first is I'm just going to show you Azure Local in connected mode. And then for the disconnected mode, I also have something which again, I can show just a little bit in terms of how it looks like. But since it's in a disconnected environment, it's obviously a bit more rough to show, obviously, in that space to connect to. How do you connect to a disconnected environment is always the question.
Right. Yeah.
So again, as I mentioned, you could go to the Azure portal. Again, I'm saying could because you could also use APIs, right? You could also use the CLI and so on. Very important, but again, it would be pretty boring if I just show you that. So when you manage Azure Local, where you go is Azure Arc. And as I mentioned, this is really where you bridge the resources which are outside of the Azure data centers into the Azure management control plane. And you can see here, for those who are not that familiar, it's not just Azure Local, but there's also like Kubernetes clusters you could put in, different types of servers, could be physical, could be virtual, could run on-prem, could be running at other cloud providers as well. So you can connect those and use the management technologies there. But what we want to talk about is Azure Local today. So Azure Local comes in as a whole environment which we can connect. And so if I go to Azure Local, I can then basically get my getting started things. But if I go to all systems, I can now see here, these are all different Azure Local instances or clusters, right? So you can see here, for example, at the top, some of these clusters have 4 nodes. We have like 1 node systems here for testing, 2 node systems. Again, depending on what you need, you can scale up to these specific clusters. You can scale up from 1 to 64 nodes, depending on what you need. And then we have also multi-rack, which I show you in a little bit as well, is up to 128 nodes, per instance. So again, if I want to manage that, I can basically, let's go to my favorite one. It's the Zurich instance that's basically running at my home. So again, not necessarily a data center, but you get the point. And you can see here, for those who are not familiar with this, it looks and feels like an Azure resource, right? It doesn't look different, even though it's connected from the outside world. It's still part of a Azure subscription and of a resource group. So that it's still part of the resource manager. And that also allows you to then do role-based access control, similar as you do for all your Azure resources as well. And then if you look at the left, there's a couple of things you can do to do some management here. And then on the machines, you can see the physical nodes. So in this case, again, as I said, it's just a 1 node system. But here you would see like all the nodes you have there. Then you can receive the workload, different workload types. So in this case, I have a couple of VMs running here. I have some Kubernetes clusters I can deploy here and so on. And you can see here, you can actually go in and choose to deploy that specific VM, and it looks and feels like Azure. The differences here, right? So if I go to, let's just give me an example a little bit just to show you the differences. So again, I give the VM name, but then instead of deploying to an Azure region, I'm going to deploy to what we call custom locations. And that's basically the Azure Local location, in this case, Zurich. And we then also identify that this is not a regular Azure VM, but this is specifically for Azure Local. You can then do security settings. So we offer today standard or trusted launch virtual machines. And then that said, we're also working on confidential compute VMs, also on Azure Local as well there. You can then select an image. So in my case, I just have some Windows images, but again, you can also have your Linux images as well. Define the size, attach a GPU here as well. And we offer you 2 setups and a DDA for that discrete device assignment, which basically gives a full GPU to that VM. Or you can use GPU partitioning, which then partitions up the GPU, and you can you basically assign that to multiple VMs. You can enable guest management, so you get some more management capabilities, talk about connectivity, define username, password, and so on. And then you can also, for example, add data disk, networking, and so on. And at the end, you would create the VM. You would also get an ARM template. You could use Terraform. You could use Bicep. Again, whatever you like to deploy. And then after a few minutes or seconds, depending on the speed of your system, the VM would show up here. Some other interesting things, since we are on a security podcast, there's a couple of things on operations. So first of all, we do offer disaster recovery. So obviously the whole system is usually built high available, right? Except if you have a 1 node cluster. But once you have more than 1 node, then you can build different types of availability, HA, and so on. You can also then deploy things like disaster recovery. So you can either replicate the VM to Azure, to failover to Azure. So if your local instance goes down, you can use Azure as a failover target. Or what we're also working on is site to site, so between 2 Azure locals recovery as well. So you can either do that on the storage level. So if you use SAN storage, you can use that, or you could do it on a VM level as well. And then on updating, I think that is very interesting. So imagine you have a virtualization environment. Usually you go out, you patch node for node, and there's some tools who help you automate that. With Azure Local, this is really looked as a solution. So once a month, we ship a update package, which again, because I'm a responsible admin, I already patched my system for May, as you can see here. But we ship this update package. And this includes all the patches for management, but also for the nodes, the hypervisor, for security features and quality updates, right? And then you basically just click install now. This will check if your infrastructure is ready to basically be updated, that there's not going to be an issue, right? There's nothing broken or something like that. And if you're healthy, it will then basically update the management components, go out to the first physical node, move all the workloads off that with live migration so that they have no downtime, patch that node, make sure it's back up, and do that to the next nodes within the cluster there as well. And the great thing about this is not just do we ship our updates through this, but with our premier solution partners, OEMs, with these offerings, they also ship update packages for firmware and drivers, which are tested specifically for Azure Local. And then they show up here as well. And so they take the same update mechanism. They can take advantage of this as well. So it's super easy for you to also make sure that your drivers and firmware are up to date. Good. And then for the security podcast, I think there's multiple things. So let me quickly go first to security defaults. So security is obviously a very big part. The cloud gives you a lot of security, and we want to make sure if you deploy locally that you also are secure, as secure as possible, right? And the solution should be secure by design. So we have some core security settings here, again, where we check also during installation and tell you, hey, by the way, is this all working? And again, if something is not working, we will tell you, right? In my case, I have two things which are, because it's a demo environment, which are not working. So it tells me how to fix those things as well. But again, that's one part. We also integrate with Windows Defender application control on the Azure Local nodes, so that you cannot run any applications except for what you whitelist basically there, or what we like, obviously by default whitelist. And then if you need to deploy some third-party agents on these, you would need to whitelist those as well. And then we look at encryption. So we do encryption for the different volumes for data, but also for the OS volumes. And again, we can see if something is not configured correctly, we will tell you how you would fix that. And then same thing for network traffic, for encryption in transit. We basically say, okay, hey, is there the SMB traffic protected between those physical nodes, for example?
And Thomas, can I bring my own key, my CMK, like we know in Azure Public, or is that something that's not available yet?
It's not the same available yet. I mean, you could have local, of course, because Azure Local is integrated into your local environment, right? So when depending on which level you need it, if you need it on the application layer, if the application can connect to, for example, a local HSM, if you have a local HSM or something, that scenario would work, right? But we don't have an integration for that in Azure Local currently. We have some other key management things there we can talk about, but I get a lot of questions around HSMs, right? And you can use those because it's your local environment, but that would be in the workloads side there as well.
Right, in the workload space.
Yeah. And then when we have Defender, the great thing about this is now what you can see here. It's not just about if you want to protect the virtualization infrastructure. We really want to look at this at the whole stack. So for example, you can see here, okay, we look at the Azure Local instance, we look at the physical machines, we look at the virtual machines on top, as well as on the Kubernetes clusters that you might run, right? In my case, I don't have one on this specific Azure Local cluster, but they would show up here. So you would also get an end-to-end view of security incidents. You can see here also same thing for recommendations. So for the machines, those are the physical nodes. And then you can see here some of the recommendations I get for the virtual machines running on top. As you're familiar with, like probably using it in Azure.
Will that work also with local disconnected? Do I have there a Defender for cloud as well?
Yeah, excellent question. So in disconnected, we are only offering a subset of the services we can offer like in connected. So, and since Microsoft Defender is really a cloud-based solution, which has like is designed from the cloud and also learns a lot from the cloud, the way it works, right? It's not something we can just take and ship locally. Now, so Defender for cloud, as you know today, is only available if you're in a connected state. But we're looking into what security features can we take and bring also to a disconnected environment, right? So for example, I mean, the security default, I'm not speaking about those are already also in the disconnected port, but we're looking into like what capabilities like we can take from Defender and what can we bring, right? There's nothing we can share right now, but it's something we heard from customers that they're obviously interesting to also use Defender in these disconnected environments as well, or parts of it at least. And so far, what we do with customers who are currently deploying, they would basically use some third-party tooling which can run fully disconnected, right? As you know, like Defender space is really about connected. I also have, by the way, just saying, I also have scenarios where customers say, hey, we're going to deploy disconnected for the Azure Local infrastructure, but we do, for example, still use Defender on top of the workload VMs and Kubernetes clusters, for example. So that is still something you could do. And then they can use it until they need to be completely disconnected, right? Like they could leave that running. So that's also something I've talked with customers about. So there are different options of doing that. Also monitoring, similar service kind of from the cloud, right? Where you get Azure Monitor, and then you can basically get the monitoring data from your infrastructure here as well, which you then can basically monitor your virtual machines. This only in this view, we see it only if it's running, but if you install the agent within the virtual machines, you can obviously get much more performance data out of it as well, and so on. And then storage, same thing, which is very important usually for these environments to also see IOPS and latency and so on, how I'm doing there. So this is just a quick overview about this. I also want to quickly just point you out this cluster here, for example, because one node cluster is probably a little bit boring on the hardware side. But here we have a 4-node cluster. And what we did here, what you can see here, we're using something called rack-aware clustering. So in this case, we have 2 nodes in rack A and 2 nodes in rack B. And so when you deploy a workload, you can basically choose the zone of where you deploy it, and then basically select zone A, rack A, or zone rack B. And again, this can be spread over campus, for example, as well. It could be different rooms, as long as it's in the latency requirements for this. But you can basically split those as well, which is pretty interesting then.
But is it then only divided, or does it also replicate to each other in the racks?
The storage is still replicated, yes. So we make sure that then you have data copies in both racks, right? So So the idea is that one rack could completely fail and you have the other rack. Yes, absolutely. Exactly. For the VMs, it's interesting when you do deploy. I want to quickly show just a second. I mean, same thing I showed before with one exception. And here we have this availability zone placement now on this cluster, right? Because we have that rack-aware clustering, we can now say, hey, again, rack A or rack B, and then we can even do strict placement, right? If we don't do strict placement, the VM would then, if rack A goes down and it's in rack A, it would basically start in rack B. In some cases, I want that. In other cases, I want to make sure that that VM is not coming over because I already have a VM there. For example, if I do guest clustering or things like that. So I can also do strict placement there as well.
Can I force it to be available on both availability zones in this picture? Do I have to select one of them?
So you can also say no, then it will just put it of them, the one which offers more space. The data will always be replicated. Like the data, like on around there will always be replicated. But the VM can only run on one physical server, right? And it depends on where that server is. And again, if you don't do availability placement, if again one rack goes down, the VM will just, similar as for every other cluster, it will just start on the other 3 nodes, right? Which are free. But this helps you, for example, think about if you do, let's say you have 2 Active Directory domain controllers or a SQL cluster. Let's talk about the SQL cluster. So you have one VM which you want to have in rack A. You don't really care about which server in rack A, so as long as it's in rack A. And then the other server to deploy for the VM cluster, you deploy in rack B. And so you want to make sure that they are not together, right? You just, like, because if you deploy it like with none, it would just mean it could be that both are in rack A or both are in rack B, right? With this, you can actually control that feature. Yeah.
And is it on the roadmap that you're also going to offer availability zones as we know it in public cloud? Like for my Kubernetes environment, for instance, that I have one node in each zone?
I need to check on the Kubernetes side. I mean, this is similar for the VM part, as you know from the zoning. I need to check what we do on the AKS part. I'm not sure. I assume we also do things there and integrate with that. What is also interesting, by the way, I mean, this is now currently done with a hyper-converged setup. So if I go back here and I look at the physical machines, you can see here, this is basically a hyper-converged setup, right, where you have the storage integrated into the nodes. We will also offer that if you help you to design that when you have SAN storage as well, so that you can also do spread out and you can do a little bit even cooler things, I would say, than with SAN storage in the future as well. So there's more options then for this offering there. Good, but enough of this. Again, this is probably what a lot of people have already seen. Another thing I want to quickly show you is something I haven't really shown a lot of people, is when we talk about multi-rack. So multi-rack, again, imagine you have these clusters where you need to have really large instances. And you can see here, in this environment, I have just one Azure Local instance, but it has 72 nodes in this case. Not really 128 in this case, but you get the point. It could go up to 128 workload clusters. That's what we have tested. Again, this limitation is fairly to testing, right? So it could potentially, if customers would ask for larger instances. However, as you know, there might be scenarios where you still have, like, even if you have very large environments, you still want to have multiple instances just to be also protecting yourself from instance failures or something like that. And so, again, I don't want to show too much, but what you can see here in this case, you do all the management of this directly from the Azure control plane. So you have, for example, here also the network devices in there and so on. And then if you go to compute racks, you can see here the different racks. And if you go to like a rack here, you can then basically get information about that specific rack. And then on the bare metal machines, you would then see all the physical servers running in this specific rack here as well. If you go to the server, you could basically go out and do some power management stuff here to turn it off, restart it, re-image it, and so on, or take it out and move the workloads off this as well. So that is kind of like a quick view on multi-rack. There's obviously more to show. You can then also go and deploy workloads there as well, as again, integrates perfectly also with Azure Resource Manager. So you get all the role-based access control there as well.
Looking awesome. Wow.
Yeah, no, it's good. As you go to the machines, right, you have this massive list of compute here, which you can basically have in that environment, right? So again, if you have these very large amount of compute you need, then multi-rack is a great solution for you. Again, depending on what you need, right? There's, like, as I said, with the other version, we can go up to 64 nodes as well, which is already a lot. Currently, we have nodes which can have up to 320 cores in the catalog for these disaggregated model. So with 64 nodes times 320, you get quite some compute power there as well.
Definitely.
Yeah. So again, it really depends on what the customers want, what the design is, right? And that is where we as Microsoft help and our partners help to define, okay, what is the right solution. Good. Yeah, that was basically a quick introduction for those who haven't seen Azure Local.
Yeah, awesome. And are there specific elements in the disconnected variant that you wanted to show?
Oh, yes, you actually bring up a good point. I got so excited and carried away. Yeah. So let me quickly bring this back. So again, talking about disconnected. Now, again, to not like bore you with me connecting to a disconnected environment with all the security measures and so on, what I did, I took some print screens here to actually go and compare the environments, right? On the left, I zoom in here. This is public Azure, the Azure portal as you know it. And this is what I just showed you, how you manage these different clusters here and environments. Now in disconnected, this is how the portal looks like. Now there's some small differences here, as you can recognize. So first of all, you have your own URL here as well to actually go and access that. And then you can see here it says Azure Local. But again, my point here, it has the same look and feel you have from the Azure control plane. And again, it's not just that we made the portal look the same or whatever. It's the same portal. Don't get all the features, of course, for that, but you get the same experience. And then you have also Azure Resource Manager. So if you then go in and look at the management experience, this is how it would then look in an Azure Local disconnected environment. And you can see here, I mean, if I just show you this very quickly, you won't be really able to recognize that there's any difference, right? Like it's still the same. So again, this is Azure Local. And then also, if you look at managing, now this is the Berlin cluster. This is the disconnected one I have in our environment. And so you can see here, it still looks and feels like an Azure environment. It has even local subscriptions. So these are subscriptions, not the Azure subscription, but local subscriptions. It had the concept of resource groups, right? So you have the same RBAC model you can leverage and all that. We can use the same things as you're familiar with in Azure. One of the big differences you can also see here, instead of having it connected to one of the Azure regions, it says this is an autonomous region, right? Meaning that it never needs to connect to Azure. It's completely disconnected in that case. And then that's basically how it works. Again, what you can see here is also, by the way, you just see connect. This is the workload cluster connecting to the locally running control plane, right? That's what this means in that case. And then again, you can see here, you obviously don't have all the settings yet. This is also, by the way, an early screenshot of the portal, but here you could manage then the physical machines of that workload cluster. And then here you have the resources you would manage, like virtual machines I just showed you, as well as Kubernetes clusters and so on in disconnected. So yeah, that's the disconnected part. I know this is, and there's obviously a lot of things to think of, right, when you do disconnected. There's certain things you need to connect to your local environment. So for example, identity provider. In public cloud, as you saw, I was logged into the Azure portal. I used Entra for doing that, right? There were things in place for that. If you're in a disconnected environment, you need to have an identity provider. And for that one, we currently use Active Directory with ADFS to basically authenticate against the control plane. Same thing for monitoring, right? You want to have a monitoring environment. So the Azure Local disconnected appliance can gather monitoring information. However, you probably need to be alerted. You want to have all that information. So you can integrate it with your existing local monitoring tool you're already using, for example, as well. Or you could use System Center Operations Manager, for example, to basically gather that information out and then also do your alerting or automation, whatever you want to kick off. And those are kind of like the things which you need to take care of, right, in the disconnected part. Yeah.
Will those tools come available in the future? Is Microsoft going to investigate to make a total package of it, or is it just?
I mean, if you look at it, it's already a package, kind of, right? So there's already Microsoft. I mean, Active Directory, ADFS, System Center Operations Manager, these are already Microsoft technology you can use today, right? So, and then the question also becomes a little bit, when we spoke with customers, is a little bit, do you want it to be, because what happens if Azure Local goes down? If those components are part of Azure Local, that would obviously impact the whole thing as well. So some things should live outside of the Azure Local itself, right? Like, so those are the questions, design questions you would have in such an environment. So that's where, but of course we are optimizing. So the team is working hard on like helping bring more features, more capabilities to Azure Local disconnected operations, listening especially to customer requests. What do they need right now? How can we make it easier to onboard and so on? But so far with the customers we spoke, they were pretty happy about these scenarios, how to connect these environments, right, and use these identity providers. I mean, that's always a little bit like you need to integrate, right? Like, so when we do it with connected, we can integrate it into the cloud. If we do it disconnected, we need to integrate into the data center.
Okay.
So,
that makes sense. If you have to rephrase everything in a one-liner, what would it be? How do you see the Azure connected versus the disconnected one?
Versus. I don't necessarily see it as a versus. I see it as an extension, right? So really Azure Local can provide you that AI-enabled infrastructure for your workloads running in a connected or in a completely disconnected environment, offering the benefit of these cloud management and cloud service capabilities. I think that is kind of like where I look at it. I don't necessarily look at it. Of course, you need to sometimes compare what do I get in connected and what do I do get in disconnected. But most of the time, it's not like I try to figure out, or we speak with the customer, what do you need, right? Like, what are your requirements? And in some cases, it turns out connected works absolutely fine for them. In some cases, comes out, hey, we need to be completely disconnected. Disconnect is the way. And then also, it can be that like both scenarios are absolutely fine, right? Some clusters can be connected, then they can take advantage of Defender part and so on. And then they have some workloads which they want to be really isolated as well. And that's where the disconnected part comes in. And don't forget, I mean, I'm not just speaking about the Azure local side of the things, but most of these customers, they're also using public Azure for, I guess, most of their workloads as well, right? So that's even the third pillar or the main pillar is like using Azure as the main thing. And then they all the things they can't put in Azure, that's where they go and say, hey, we need to have something locally. And then the question there is it needs to be disconnected or connected. And so, yeah, that's basically how we think about this. It's always, when I speak with customers, we quickly sometimes end up in a trap where, okay, what do I need, right? But at the end, it's not against each other's. It's actually the beauty of like what we can offer is like we can also offer all these different capabilities depending on where a specific workload needs to live. And you still get the same management capabilities. You still get the same tooling. You still get the same services, right? So you still have that. And I think that's a unique position for Microsoft.
If I'm new to this topic, I just want to get started. What is your advice there?
So if you just want to learn a little bit more about Azure Local, I think that we have a lot of documentation. I'm sure we can put maybe some links into the description. For Azure Local, I think I would go first to aka.ms/Azure Local. That brings you to the product page, and from there you find documentation and so on. Now, if you're looking into the sovereign space, we also have a page for sovereign cloud where we go into sovereign public cloud and sovereign private cloud as well, where we talk a little bit also more about the concepts. We talk about landing zones, for example, and things like that with super interesting topics as well. And then if you actually want to get hands-on experience with Azure Local and you don't necessarily have the hardware to do it, I recommend that you go to jumpstart.azure.com. And then we have a tool there, which is called LocalBox. And LocalBox is a sandbox environment you can deploy in your Azure subscription, and it will simulate you a Azure local cluster. It will basically automatically deploy this for you. It will take a few hours because quite some work with all the automation running through. But again, it's not much work for you to do. It's just the time you need to wait until the deployment is finished. And then you have an environment where you can then basically test out Azure Local. Now, keep in mind that this is obviously deployed in a very, very large Azure VM. So there's some cost involved in this, and we obviously put that on the website. We have a calculation how much that would cost if you run it for a day, if you run it for a month, or whatever. Again, you can obviously shut it down or delete it, and then you're basically done with it. So that is something where if you really want to get hands-on experience.
Thomas, I want to thank you very much for your time, also for the demo, for the explanation. I think it's a lot of stuff, cool stuff to get involved with. Any last thoughts that you want to share?
No, thank you so much for having me. Again, this was super exciting for me to share a little bit about what we're doing in the sovereign private cloud space, as well as in the sovereign cloud space in general. Again, if customers want to try it out, or if you actually want to start running a project, feel free to reach out either to Microsoft or to, for example, your favorite partner in that space or OEM partner.
Let's wrap it up. For everybody at home, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. If you have any thoughts, please leave them below. And otherwise, I would say thank you very much and take care. Till next time.